Throughout history, there have been many different execution methods used to bring the life of someone to an end. Some of these were barbaric, and were aimed to prolong life and make the suffering much worse. In England there was hanging, drawing and quartering, and each of the different steps were savage, and made the execution ordeal incredibly terrible. Across different lands, people enjoyed watching brutal executions. For example, the breaking wheel, in which someone was strapped to a wheel and was then battered and brutalised using clubs and other weapons. And in France, people even hated the guillotine which replaced the breaking wheel, as it was deemed to have been too clinical. But one of the worst execution methods was immurement, or being walled in or locked in alive. People were locked in structures too, and were forced to face their impending death in a painful and awkward position, and they knew every day that it could be their last. One of the worst execution methods, though, was the Mongolian Coffin, a variation of this, but why was it so bad? To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Inside of Mongolian prisons, the conditions were known to have been rather brutal and barbaric. In fact, one visitor in the early 1900s to a prison in the land described the harrowing and horrific incarcerations, and he stated that he saw a number of prisoners who were chained in coffin-like boxes, and they were exposed to the freezing cold Mongolian winter, being only given a single sheepskin to stay alive. It was claimed that the prisons and dungeons of the Far Eastern country contain a number of refined Chinese, shut up for life in heavy iron-bound coffins, which do not permit them to sit upright or lie down. These prisoners see daylight for only a few minutes daily, when the food is thrown into their coffins through a very small hole. Inside of these coffin prisons, the conditions were terrible. The victim was rammed into these tiny spaces, and they could not lie down, and they were often stooped over, and they also had their movements severely restricted, and they could not move. Often the prisoners were not fed anything, which would mean they would starve to death as well, but some cruel guards did feed the prisoners and victims, and they would then prolong their ordeal, keeping them alive for much longer. If they received food, it was passed through a tiny hole, and the coffin was also usually filled with human waste and excrement, as the victims would relieve themselves where they sat. But one of the most brutal parts of the Mongolian coffin was the psychological torture that the victims were placed under. They were trapped in almost darkness for days, weeks and months on end, and they would hear the screams and cries of the other inmates who were locked in the devices. Many of the prisoners lost their minds, and they were confronted with death on a daily basis. Many prisoners did die from the starvation and the harsh conditions, succumbing to the diseases inside the cramped boxes and the rampaging germs. The boxes themselves measured roughly 4 feet long by 2 feet wide, and they were roughly around 1.5 feet tall, and some of them were fixed to 15 feet palisades in the air. The majority of those prisoners who were locked inside the Mongolian coffins were Chinese soldiers who had invaded the land and who had been captured as prisoners of war. Albert Khan and Stefan Passé visited Mongolia, and they captured the infamous photograph of a woman who was condemned to a slow execution inside of a wooden crate which was left in a remote part of the desert, and she was left to die. The Mongolian coffins were a brutal and barbaric execution method that was banned in its use in the 1920s. They were a shocking execution device in which someone would be locked in, and they would be unable to move fully. They were similar to oubliettes in the fact that they restricted movement, and also led to people dying slow and harrowing deaths, and they were also psychological torture. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.